Welcome back to the Typecast, where we explore intersections of theology and culture, spirituality and culture. Today, the Typecast. This is where I respond to listener questions. Y'all, I don't know that this is not what I'm supposed to be regularly doing with this time, as in mostly doing with this time. It's probably the thing I enjoy doing most, pastorally, personally, whatever. Thank you for your questions. There's a spot at jonathanmartinwords.com to submit your questions. I don't think I've mentioned that out loud on the Zeitcast yet. So I'm really encouraged that some of you have been finding this already and that some really dear, special people have been finding this. So I want to respond to questions today. That's what's coming up. The idea of the Typecast is that there'll be plenty of these where I'm going to be actually responding with written letters. Sometimes it will be verbal. Today, there are verbal in the midst of this kind of intense season of Advent. Speaking of Advent, we're well into it now, a couple days in. I do have to make the plug that the ebook is free, depending on when you're listening to this. I'm recording late Tuesday afternoon. By the way, it's very cold in Greencastle, Indiana. The reason my face looks like this is because I have this smart idea. I thought, it's cold, there's snow on the ground, Advent vibes. So I thought I'll record a little outside this morning while it was still like 15 degrees. And I look like I recorded outside in 15 degrees this morning. But it's lovely. Book of Waiting, Reflections on Advent and Christmas. The ebook is still going to be free through the end of the day, Wednesday, December 4th. So know you can pick that up for free. Little gift from me to you. This is a labor of love and a passion project. So I hope that'll be helpful for somebody. Otherwise, both the hardback and the paperback are available if that's helpful. But I want to get right down to business because I've got some wonderful questions here. Now, I intentionally did not prep for these at all. I glanced at them just enough to know that they're great questions, but I really wanted the vibe to be much more responding to these in real time. I do have a sense, though, at least to know that there are some through lines here, and that's instructive to me. So let's go. First question is from Carla Neese. Hi, Carla. I know Carla. Carla's a great person. And so Carla's question goes like this. Carla says, I've been thinking for the past few days as I've listened to some of your podcast episodes, just finished the one with Ben Kramer. I agree that was a great episode. I love Ben. So good. It got me to realize that there's so much talk about deconstruction in the past few years, but that doesn't really define where I'm at. I'm in the process of reconstructing my faith. I'd love to know some resources you recommend for the process of renewing my view of the Bible and how to see it through this new lens. I'm not a theology student, nor do I know really where to begin, but I'd love to hear/read you share how to do that. Just some ideas. How do I read the Bible with fresh eyes that don't automatically hear the voice of the ridiculous church quotation mark truth I've left behind? Truth, not truth, is that quotation mark truth is what I want now. Carl, this question is like music to me. Because I think this is where so many of us are now, right? Is that we have a sense of what we don't want. We have a sense of what doesn't work for us. But some of us, that's important. It's important. The disillusionment phase is important. But now that a lot of us are reconstructing, and it's not enough to just be disenchanted, but we're ready for some re-enchantment. And I think the re-enchantment is really where the magic is. I think it's where the beauty is. Because who wants to just go around being cynical all the time, right? This is very much where I would put myself, and I think a lot of us are. What does the reconstruction look like now? While that can be scary in its own way, I think it's also really exciting, especially the more that we discover all of these resources in the vast history of the church and the experience and diverse witness of the church that we're able to draw from. There's a lot of things that come to mind, but I'll just mention a few that I find to be especially helpful and that I think might be helpful for you on some level. One, I would definitely feel remiss to not mention a book by a dear friend of mine, Rachel Holt Evans, wrote a book called Inspired. I know that a couple books have been put out since her death, but I'm thinking that was the last one that she wrote, that she put out before her death. Inspired is a gorgeous book. And in fact, the conversation I always think of, I don't know if you heard this one, Carla, but we recorded about 2 or 3 months before she died. I was at her and Dan's home, and that conversation is special now to me in all kinds of ways. It's one I revisit often, but it was a lot of that very conversation is us talking about that kind of re-enchantment and what it means to sort of revisit scripture now on the other side of a lot of shift. But I think her book Inspired is a really helpful guide. And of course, Rachel, just what a beautiful person and what a guide for so many of us. This book is a little more dense and a little more theological, but another friend of the podcast, I would certainly recommend Dr. Chris Green's book, Sanctifying Interpretation. That's Chris's attempt to articulate a Pentecostal hermeneutic. So for those of you who, like me, come from this kind of Pentecostal charismatic tradition, which I think even for those of you who do not come from this tradition, can be really helpful for those who are in a process of reconstructing, because the whole Pentecostal way of doing theology it's radically experiential, and it's spirit led. It's grounded both in firsthand experience and also the broader experience and witness of the church in ways that I feel like are going to resonate with the kind of authenticity that all kinds of people are looking for right now. So I think Sanctifying Interpretation, if you're open to something a little heavier, a little more and heady and theological, I think Chris's book is really helpful. I'll say this a little more broadly, though. I'll say that in general, it's been really helpful for me to spend time. Two sources I'll mention. It's been helpful for me to spend time with the church fathers here, these early church writers and thinkers. And I've found the Black church witness to be especially helpful for me in how I read scripture. It's interesting how those two sources really converge. For one, I would say that they both defy the rule book that a lot of us were given, especially if you grew up in more kind of fundamentalist and evangelical churches. See, a lot of people kind of think that Pentecostal and charismatic churches are more fundamentalist evangelical because they act like that now, and they've gravitated there culturally in terms of like culture wars and stuff. But keep in mind, historically, they were not. That Pentecostal and charismatic folks were kicked out of fundamentalist churches precisely for reasons like this. Early fundamentalists, including fundamentalist scholarship, was actually really strict on this idea. They're very rigid rules about how you're supposed to read the Bible, and that often included a kind of historical criticism that was really not just tethered to the ground. I mean, there was really just such a strict sense, and often a constricting sense of what the text was supposed to do and how the text was supposed to work. Because to use a word I used a couple minutes ago, there was no sense of enchantment to it, right? There is no sense of magic. There is no sense of mystery to it. In a lot of ways, the text is really pretty wooden. It's kind of a historical account of how God has spoken, but it's not dynamic. It's not lively. It's not speaking now in that lively, spirit-led, spirit-breathed way that in many ways I do think I was given within the Pentecostal tradition. So what we see in the church fathers and what we see within Black church tradition is that scripture, for example, is often read allegorically. It would be common, whether in reading the Hebrew prophets or maybe reading in, say, like the Genesis story or even reading in the Gospels, to have these really beautiful, really gorgeous, really poetic readings of the text. That actually in fundamentalism, I think we were just more often than not taught you're not supposed to do that. You're not allowed to do these kind of allegorical readings. I actually think there's a really good and faithful way, and even necessary way, to read allegorically. I don't know. I'm thinking off the top of my head about being at. There's a wonderful every summer this still happens. There's the Proctor Institute is a beautiful experience in the Black church tradition, and I'm thinking about being there one night in particular where I heard this amazing sermon about one of these persons who's healed in the Gospels, who is mute, who has a mute spirit. And the way it's translated in the King James is that he has a dumb spirit. And so the way that comes out in the sermon is that people said he was dumb. And the way that then that kind of morphs into, because this is the whole era of, I can't breathe and police brutality. Gosh, it was just so powerful. And the imminence of that text, the immediate relevance of that text to contemporary Black experience. I mean, it was just so potent. And I think part of what we see consistently in marginalized communities is that there is such a real proximity to the lived experience of the text that is trustworthy, that can and should and must be trusted, But again, in fundamentalism, we were often taught that we can't trust that we're not supposed to trust that. And we were given these scholastic kind of resources that, weirdly enough, disenchant the text, take the mystery out. And in that regard, not only is the poetic power of the text kind of stripped away from us, not only is the language kind of laid bare in a lot of ways, but you definitely don't have that sort of primal relevance to daily life in the same way, because there's not permission to read the text in imaginative ways. I would highly recommend in this category, I would recommend anything that Walter Brueggemann has ever written on the Old Testament, on the Hebrew Bible, because Brueggemann is a genius at this, both at kind of, digging into the context around the text, but in ways that always kind of strike to the heart of what's happening in the world right now. But Brueggemann, I mean, is such an imaginative reader and thinker. I had a professor and mentor, Dr. Ricky Moore, that I talk about a lot. I've got to have him on the podcast. We talk about that forever. But Dr. Moore, as a Pentecostal Old Testament scholar, it's always made so much sense to me why he and Brueggemann vibed in a lot of ways, and they've had a beautiful kinship and friendship, because Dr. Moore is very Pentecostal, very prophetic. I mean, he really is like one of the Hebrew prophets. His way of being immersed in the prophets makes so much sense with kind of who Brueggemann is and how he carries himself in the world, because there's such a charismatic dimension to what Dr. Moore does. He's open to the surprise of the Spirit and to the freshness of the Spirit, both in the text, in the tradition, but then also in real life right now. So I think Brueggemann's one of those figures that's been really helpful to me. So this might just be some good places to start. Brueggemann, Rachel Devon's book, Inspired, Chris's book, Sanctifying Interpretation. And otherwise, I'd say anything and everything you can read, both in terms of church fathers, how they interacted with Scripture, but then also Black church tradition at large. Otis Moss III's sermons from Trinity United Church of Christ Chicago. I would listen to as many of those as you can on any given Sunday, because what he does with the text, which is so situated not just within the communal context of that church in a way that I think is really important, but then in the broader Black church tradition in America, it can't go wrong. And it is interesting when you see the ways that, I don't mean to repeat myself here, but the way that tradition, much of which was established in the 19th and 20th century in a very particular way, comes full circle with what we see in first century AD early church fathers. So might just be something that you might want to tease out and explore. But thank you, Carla. That's a really, really wonderful question. So the next question is from Joel Watson. Joel and Melissa, my good friends from Tulsa. It made me so happy to hear from you. Seriously, it brought me. This brings me a lot of joy. Hello, Jonathan. I love this typecast idea. I really hope it is fruitful and rich. I'm writing to ask for your advice on locating like-hearted Christian community. When the OEM / factory presets for modern Christianity seem to have strayed so very far afield from truly striving to live like Christ did, I despair at the thought of lucky dipping. That's a great phrase, aka walking through random church doors and finding like hearts. Where can I go to find Christ followers who value true connection over quote, camaraderie by othering. These are amazing phrases, Joel, by the way. Camaraderie by othering. Yes. Primacy of the Beatitudes versus empire idolizing nationalism. Ooh, I mean, this is a sermon in of itself. Clear-eyed and teary-eyed ownership of historical/present church sins versus egregious whitewashing. And I could ramble on, but I find myself at a loss for where and how to find, quote, my people. I feel that I now have to describe myself as, quote, Christian, but I am a Christian, but not capitalized, not like that. I can no longer simply say I am a Christian because without exhaustive caveats, it communicates so much that is not true. I am a Christian, but pro-LGBTQ+, but anti-war. But I think the best definition of sin is injustice, but God is love, above/before/beyond all else. But I believe biblical literalism needs to, quote, sit down, be humble. Great Kendrick allusion there. But nationalism is antichrist. But grace flows downhill. So God is most present in the lowest places in the margins and farthest from peaks of power, prestige, and privilege. I want to stand with those who oppose this distressing parody of Christianity that currently passes as, quote, normal. Unfortunately, Tulsa, Oklahoma must be among the worst places to attempt this. Oklahoma in general, I'm adding a footnote here, has its issues. Back to the letter. Wherever I am, I want to find the remnant. Truth be told, I'm very open to moving somewhere else in this country or even abroad in order to find this. I would prize your thoughts and any advice on where to focus my energies. Your brother in Christ, for love and against the isolation of the saints. Oh, this is making my heart so happy. All of this language, Joel. Joel, P.S. Much love to you and Nicole from the Watsons. MJ, formerly Melissa, still counts you as, quote, one of the good ones from her place outside Christianity. Gosh, I'm so humbled by this. I'm thankful for the journey that both of you are on, even though it sounds like you're landing in different places and yet on this journey together, which I think is a powerful witness in and of itself. And I'm instructed by that. So thank you for it. Boy, I so get it in terms of not wanting to just show up on a Sunday morning and open the doors and kind of play Russian roulette and see what kind of experience you're going to have. On the one hand, I know the only kind of tried and true way to test that out is with the internet. Where that gets a little tricky is I think a lot of the buried treasure that's out there, a lot of the churches that maybe have the most to offer in this way might, in some cases, in fact, I would say often, have some of the least established kind of presences on the internet for whatever the reason. That's the kind of stuff that I feel like evangelicalism sometimes excels in. Evangelicalism has always been kind of awesome and ahead of its time at communication. Think about Billy Graham. The early use of like radio and television. These were like innovations that evangelicalism was always at the forefront of, and that I feel like mainline and Protestant expressions tend to lag behind. So that's the conundrum, isn't it? I mean, I think definitely doing some due diligence and some research online can be helpful. Part of what's tricky for me in knowing how to answer this best is it feels like a bit of a retreat to sort of just make this about kind of name brands, certainly among some denominations, some expressions more so than others. I certainly think there is a higher likelihood in some expressions, more so than others, of finding the kind of thing that you are looking for. But I also know that within those expressions, there is a diversity of thought and a diversity of expression. I can tell you right now that I'm really encouraged by my own experience within the United Methodist Church in Indiana in terms of like our leadership here. I do know of some wonderful UMC churches in Oklahoma. I don't know that much about the scene in Tulsa. I've been really encouraged by some of my experiences within the Episcopal Church. I actually think my first impulse here, in terms of where are you most likely to find all of these things, um, and I think this might really be worth trying. If you are open to kind of like cold, just walking through the doors of a church you've not tried, I really think going to a black church, historic black church, really might be the way to go. I think, especially in terms of that really established witness against empire, that kind of radical church witness, and that kind of witness for love. I feel like that for me is has continues to be the most faithful, consistent place to find a witness for resistance. I know I bring up Trinity United Church of Christ a lot, and I just did. But one of the things that I love about it, of course, historically, Dr. Jeremiah Wright pastored there, now Otis Miles III. But all over the campus, they have these flags, banners, that have this expression of uh, unashamedly black and unapologetically Christian. And I find that so interesting because while being rooted in a very particular cultural identity, I've never seen more radical hospitality to everybody else. And I think there's something to that. I think there's something to being rooted in a very particular tradition that actually allows and enables a people to know how to relate to everybody else. And so in that regard, I really feel like, that I just find the black church prophetic witness. And I say this, of course, not as some kind of a rebuke or something, but when people are kind of deconstructing, kind of moving out of one thing, but don't know what's next, I think oftentimes the thing that some of us are looking for, but don't have language for, and this is not a way of idealizing, because it's not like there aren't problems and issues within the black church too. And I've had people in those expressions tell me about it in terms of, patriarchy, certain kinds of traditional expressions. I still think on the whole, it's the most fruitful place to look. And I'm glad that you were looking. I do want to say that. I'm thinking that y'all are probably aware, I believe, that Jared McKenna and Drew Hart, what they do with the Inverse community online, I think is really helpful. And I still connect to that community wherever I can online. But I know that's not the same thing as like having a community in person. But I just so get you in terms of not wanting to just open the doors and see what happens. I will say this, though, as a way of complicating things, which is often what I feel like I do when I try to answer a question in earnest. So the little community that I pastor out in the middle of the country, Fillmore United Methodist, right now we basically have no digital footprint. I think somebody in the church used to have access to a Facebook page that we don't currently have access to. And we're trying to figure it out. But right now we basically have no footprint online, and Fillmore is a town of 500 people. So we are trying to fix this sooner rather than later. I've been there for, about a year. But one of the things I found really refreshing about a community like Fillmore is that it almost exists a little bit off the grid of certain conversations about culture wars. I think in terms of some of the stuff that we deal with in evangelicalism and ex-evangelicalism, whatever, it's just not in the water there in ways that I found to be really refreshing. Nothing that we do is entertaining or would have any kind of entertainment value. And now that being said, there's also not, if you come to our church on a Sunday morning, I don't know that the language is like super radical justice, but it's so Jesus centric. And I do think there is something radical about the kind of hospitality that's there. And I'll put it like this, while I don't feel like the church historically has kind of camped out on social issues, there's a couple in the church, their daughter and her wife have, had moved back to the area for a time, and they were over at my house here, like actually just a week ago, and 2 weeks ago, I guess. And that was one of the things that she said, it's like, I don't know where everybody like here is like ideologically, but I've never felt more welcome and accepted and like love than I do like kind of being within this community. And I feel like in general, there've been so many things about this little place that has I just think would be surprising to people in the midst of such a red kind of rural area. Um, it's I don't know. It just all the things that are best about a place that is a little bit more unplugged. So while I completely understand not wanting to just swing the doors open and take a chance, I I am now kind of a first person witness to the kinds of communities that are out there that wouldn't necessarily be on the radar any other kind of way. But again, I hardly would recommend that as a strategy because I know you are Nicole talks about it this way. Actually, she talks about Fillmore as a place of such radical welcome. One of the things in terms of her experience is that I think she has dealt in her own way with a whole lot of judgment and hostility, oddly, in a lot of church spaces. She says it's the first time I've ever felt not even a hint of that. Like no one sizing me up, like no judgment, no shade. But I don't know if you'd like driving by our church or like looking at the sign. I don't know that you would assume that. I think you'd think like a little church out in the middle of the country, whatever. So I don't know. There are surprises. There are surprises. So for whatever that's worth, I don't know how to best navigate both that sort of openness to the surprise of the Spirit and both also the understandable need, especially when you're trying to navigate this with your family, for a kind of safety. And it's not like it's not like the thing where we're like 21 and just kind of experimenting with whatever. Like I get that. Also, the fact that y'all like us have navigated a lot of religious trauma and difficulty and might need some kind of assurances on the front end. But so for whatever that's worth, I don't know if that's more muddying than clarifying. I know that it's been a lot of grace for me to know that there are still pleasant surprises that are out there, and it's been healing. It's been restorative. It's been healing for me to be in a community where it's almost all elders, and most of the people there could be like grandparents. That's something I feel like, and you didn't express anything like this at all. There was nothing about like age or something, but I feel like sometimes people who are kind of coming out of evangelicalism are hoping for something a little younger, hipper, trendier, that you probably aren't going to necessarily find culture in this way. For me, that's been very nurturing, like this sense of like, no, it's really been good for me to be in a community where I have like elders who have a faith that's very connected and kind of that gift of kind of receiving a blessing, maybe that some of us felt like maybe we haven't had. I think I might not have known how much I needed that or craved that until getting it in this way. So in a way now to where I'm almost kind of evangelistic about that, wanting people to experience that sort of like, not even just father, mother kind of blessing, but the kind of grandparents blessing. I was saying at the church I pastor in Charlotte that we're not just your grandmother's church, but your great grandmother's church and your great great grandmother's church, like something of that sense of continuity. I just know a lot of people, to your initial question, have felt really burned by that church. But if you are able somehow to be connected to something where there is a sense of that kind of continuity in history and yet have a sense of blessing, what a beautiful thing that is, to have old people in your life who remember your kids' birthdays and send cards and notice when you're not there. I think those things can just be real gifts. So anyway, prayers for you and blessings on that journey, because I do know that Oklahoma is not always the easiest in terms of finding the right kind of space. I have one more question that I wanted to make sure that I field, and as y'all can tell, I feel like all of these really are just sort of soul feast in and of themselves, and this is no exception. And everybody's I think is okay with me reading these out loud. Dear Jonathan, I'm so grateful for you and your work, as your words have both challenged and comforted me for the better part of the last decade. Like you, I grew up as a Pentecostal in the Church of God and was even licensed as a minister through the Church of God in my early 20s. However, I became disillusioned with the Pentecostal world during the early years of Trump's first presidency due to the political idolatry of many, if not most, Pentecostal leaders and my own shifting thoughts about God, sexuality, social justice, and other theological issues. Well, as you know, this is certainly a journey that I understand. Since leaving the Church of God, I've joined and currently minister at a non-denominational church that aligns with my own queer-affirming, justice-oriented, radically inclusive theological beliefs. I absolutely love my current church, but I also miss the spirit-infused religious experiences of my youth. More than anything, I'm saddened by the continued wayward trajectory of the Pentecostal world that I once cherished. As someone with a similar background and story, do you see any glimmers of hope for the Pentecostal church at large? Are there even small numbers of Pentecostal churches who are committed to the holistic and radically inclusive gospel of Christ in our country today? Personally, I don't have a lot of hope that the American Pentecostal church will change, but perhaps you can offer some insight that I'm lacking. Thank you again for your thoughtfulness and your courage and the words that you share. All the best, Greg Ellington. P.S. You can share my name on the Typecast. Wow. Thank you, Greg, for a question that cuts close to the bone. You know, part of what's so tough about all of this is that I think there are a lot of us who are like this. We never outgrew our love for the Spirit or the things of the Spirit, praying in tongues, or the wildness to dance in the Spirit, to prophesy or to be prophesied over. There's so much beauty in it. And I know for a lot of people, some probably who still listen, maybe even might listen with a bit of suspicion, but who still listen, with whom all of that, though, is part and parcel. And they're like, with that is a holiness message that also has a certain kind of harshness, that is kind of turn or burn. It's what has to be. It's what needs to be. It's who God is. When you come to believe that that's not who God is, that's not what God is like, that's not the character of God, and yet you find that sense of Spirit to be not less alive, but maybe even more so, which is the case for me. I find myself saying this sometimes now. I'm more evangelistic than I ever was. Like, I really am. The more convinced I am of the goodness of God, I don't know how to be quiet about this. I don't know how to be shy. I desperately want people to come into the fullness of the knowledge of the love of God, because I think it changes everything. If I was passionate before about a gospel that did include heavy doses of judgment and condemnation, how much more so am I passionate now? Like, I really am. And I know some people are not like that. I get it. Sometimes I think I'm sorry, I don't mean to go the long way to get to the question, but I get that for some people, it's like when fear has been the only thing that motivates them to get out of the driveway, that then if fear is not the driver anymore, then maybe just kind of slump around. I know I don't identify with that at all, that love rightly understood is so much more motivating and invigorating. And I'm really saying that to say, I love your story so much. I love that you're in the trenches. I love that you're doing ministry. And I love that you're on the front lines. And I love that you're holding these things together. And I hear you when you say, like, you're about justice and you're about preaching the love of God and fullness, and also like, but I miss this sense of Spirit, because, brother, I do too. I miss it and I want it. And I don't think it's an indictment against anybody else to say spaces that don't have it need it. They need it. They desperately need it. They desperately need that fire. They desperately need that passion. They desperately need that kind of prophetic witness and fierceness and boldness, wildness. Like, they need it. They need it. I don't say they need us. This really. I'm not going to give disclaimers to it. I'll just say it. Steve Land's Pentecostal spirituality, however other people have interpreted that, or wherever, Dr. Land would have gone with that himself, I don't know. But I can tell you in the book, this is one of the most important things I think he says, is that Pentecostal spirituality is a renewal movement for the whole church. And that was the whole idea, is that it was never intended to be just a sect. It's supposed to be a renewal movement for the entire church. And that the gift of the Pentecostal church as this one sliver, as this one small expression, is to ultimately help the entire church discover the ways in which she is Pentecostal. But I still feel like I'm dancing around the question. You're probably like nodding your head like, yeah, sure. Because that's the reality that you're living. So I guess, sadly, well, I think there are two answers to this for me. Institutionally, no, I don't think that that's where things are going, because, and I say this without like any bitterness, rancor. There's no there couldn't be less edge to it. Culturally, the shift, the gravitational pull of Pentecostalism in recent years. Pentecostalism looks more like evangelicalism than ever has. It looks like the Southern Baptist Convention that speaks in tongues. That's way more true now than it was even a few years ago. I mean, radically so. When I was still in my Pentecostal denomination, I mean, even I'm thinking like, goodness, say 2005, 2010 to 2015, I thought there's a lot of room around the edges. There was a lot of room to be. There was not the kind of active, let's root out anybody who thinks differently about things. I think historically, really, there's significant evidence that Pentecostalism has been a pretty roomy movement. But ultimately, I think a lot of Pentecostals have taken sides in culture wars at this point. I think there are a lot of ways that the movement in its current institutional expressions is not, again, I say that without judgment, is just not connected to its roots, is not connected to its distinctives in really important and pretty critical ways. And so that now a lot of things that are culturally assumed to be Pentecostal that really don't have anything to do with this story, especially when you think about like what is it to be Pentecostal if it's not to do what these early pioneers actually did, right? Like not just to do what they did, to be willing to go against the grain, to be willing to listen to that still small voice no matter what it says, to be willing to be actually unpopular. That's the weirdest thing to me now, is that people always say these things as if they're unpopular. It's like, no, you do understand the vast majority at this point of even Americans are saying what you're saying, but that this kind of message is actually radically unpopular. I think that enemy-loving, self-sacrificing, self-giving, making space for all the table, that way of living in the world, that requires real spiritual discipline. It's robust. It's not easy. It's not saccharine. It's not cinema. I'm not telling you, Greg, anything that you don't know. I think you'd be amening all of that. But the point is, I think like all of that gets kind of lost, so that we're now what's kind of crystallized within the institutions, within the systems, is not this impulse of doing what the Pentecostal pioneers did, is not kind of listen to voice the way they listened to voice, and same way Abraham did, go leave your father's country, not like kind of embodying that kind of faith and witness, but more now lots of Pentecostals in the United States that still kind of, I know our tradition even has a very Southeastern sort of flavor to it. Well, where's the Southeast gone in these ways, culturally, politically? It has a certain accent, not just like my accent. It has a very particular accent politically, and we've seen the way that that's drifted. So I'm really over talking a thing that's very simple. No, I don't have any hope that that's where the institutions are going. Like, kind of zero. That said, I'm still pleasantly surprised and thankful for the pockets and for some very unique witnesses within those places that I think are doing some cool stuff and some exciting things. And I love everybody within the church. Again, there's no shade in this, but do I think like there's room in terms of for the institutions to move that way? I do not. What makes this so interesting is that I ultimately really do believe, as again, Greg, I'm imagining that you probably do as well, that what Pentecostalism is, at the end of the day, and what it's always been, has never really been an institution. Pentecostalism is what happens. Man, that makes me emotional to say it. I don't know why. Pentecostalism is what happens on the outer edges. It just is, right? It's what Azusa Street was. It's what happened in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, too. These are people who got kicked out of their churches, right? These were people on the outer edges of the thing. And I actually think, and we see this in Methodism, too. We see it in all kinds of revivalism. I think once you've been around long enough where you've got insiders, it's probably time for there to be another renewal and to get back to that pioneer spirit. And I think it's happening. I absolutely think it's happening. I think Pentecost continues to happen. And to be clear, I am grateful when I see it happening within the institution. And I am grateful for our many friends within the Assemblies of God, the Church of God, the Church of God of Christ, and Pentecostal holiness, and all those things. And goodness, kudos, props to all my devout friends who are doing great works like within that. But I do think in terms of that form that is more justice oriented and more inclusive, that most of that is going to happen outside of the institutions. And I think that's all right. I think it's okay. Is it there this weird way that not only in terms of secular history, but ecclesial history or ecclesiastical history, just things have a way of repeating, the patterns repeat. Don't we see it in Catholicism and Orthodox, like whatever, that the more rigid and hierarchical and structured that things become, the more that like there's this constant need for reform and renewal. And in the same way that the Pentecostal movement was born out of people that I think really did identify with what we read in the book of Hebrews, right? That Jesus was crucified outside the gate. Realistically now, Pentecostals are not outside the gate anymore. They're just not. They're not culturally outside the gate. I still can very much self-profess as a Pentecostal. We're not outside the gate. So got to be outside the gate again. And I think that that's just always where the Spirit is doing the Spirit's best work. And people will find each other out there. I think people will continue to find each other on the margins of their own respective movements. And that will be, and then there will be waves of kind of this new Pentecostal thing. So it's kind of a strange feeling to be both less than hopeful in some ways about the institutional directions, which, by the way, is something I've never talked about. I've never done that because I go that far out of my way that I really do. I am not, as much as I've talked about Trump and Trumpism and all things, I'm never really trying to point a finger at. I'm more like you fight with your own family, and that's okay. And now that I'm kind of on the outskirts of that a little bit, it's like I'm not trying to provoke any of y'all. But if you ask me a question, I'll give you an answer. Yeah, like no, I'm absolutely seeing it. The stuff, I'm not. I'll try not to name too much. I see what comes out of these spaces and even denominational meetings and stuff, and the things that people will say even casually, or videos that will be featured in ads and promos like sponsors. It is remarkable now how assumed Christian nationalism is in terms of like common language and rhetoric in ways, again, not just 10 years ago, but 5 years ago, pre-2016. It was just was not the case. But the same kind of drift. This is why I say it so often. Pentecostals in North America now are mostly Southern Baptists who also believe in speaking in tongues and maybe divine healing sometimes. But Pentecostal spirituality as a whole distinct way of life and way of being in the world, I don't think people are as clear on that as they were. Now, I know that I'd have people who say like, well, yeah, I buy that Pentecostalism is a distinct way of being in the world, but I don't agree with your kind of more inclusive. And you can think that. But I definitely, I would contend, though, that way of Pentecostalism as, for misfits and outcasts and outsiders, that inevitably it does lead to something that's less constrictive, that's more open, where there is space for the freaks. Well, I affectionately, kind of channel some of that Flannery O'Connor language sometimes. No, of course, that's within the Catholic tradition, but that's sort of like, yeah, the kind of like freaks and misfit side of Pentecostalism is what I love about it, and is what I want to embody in my own practice. So I'm glad you're out there. I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing, and I'm glad that we get to be Pentecostal wherever we are. And I find myself telling people often, not like I'm authorized. I'm not like the Pope who gets to tell people they're Pentecostal or something. But, I did with my mentor, one of my mentors, Stanley Hauerwas, years ago. That's how I introduced him and wrote about him. It's like that it's the first time I ever spoke at a Pentecostal church. Like, you're way more Pentecostal than you know. Because I saw it, right? I saw that kind of prophetic fire, that Sinai fire. And when I see people in that kind of mystic way who are listening to the Spirit and going wherever they're being led, and they hear the sound and the things that they're hearing whispered in their ear, they're shouting from the housetop, and they're willing to kind of surf with what the Spirit's given them to say and do, and they're not afraid of that taking them places that are, again, like outside the gate. I'm like, I find myself saying it fairly regularly. Like, yeah, I see you. I see you. I see that closet, or not so closet like Pentecostal. I know what you are. I know what's in there. I know that sound. I recognize that sound of the Spirit. I recognize that prophetic fire when I see it. And wherever you're listening, however you're listening, hope you feel seen and known today. What through lines through this? Whereas people are reconstructing how to read Scripture now, how to find community now, trying to find continuity, maybe trying to find a Pentecostalism that's consonant with where we are now, trying to find a tradition. Goodness, these are the kind of questions that I love to think about and I love to engage. And I've spent a lot more time on this than I meant to. I'm sure that's no surprise to anybody, but thank you. Thank you for trusting me with these questions. Again, go to jonathanmartinwords.com. Please send me more. We'll keep doing this. Check out the Book of Waiting. I hope that's helpful for you, Advent and Christmas. I never say this, and I'm supposed to be saying it all the time, I think, but liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, all the things helps a lot. So grateful to be on this Advent journey with you, and on the journey with y'all in general. Blessings, friends. We'll talk again very soon.